In today's video, I would like to address a question that I get very frequently, and that is, how do you add reverb to a Dolby Atmos object? Now, the video today is probably going to be a little bit shorter than normal, but I get this question so often that I felt it deserves its own video, so that's what I'm going to do today. But first of all, hello everybody. In case you're new here, my name is Michael Wagner. I teach at the Antoinette Westphal College of Media Arts and Design at Drexel University in Philadelphia. And on this channel, I talk about digital media, game design, and spatial audio. And if any of those topics interest you, I invite you to subscribe or join my Discord community. An invite link is in the description below. And please also don't forget to press the like button, because once again, YouTube wants us to do that. And with that being said, let's get into creating some reverbs. The way I'm going to start this today is with a very simple Cubase project. Now, if you're using another DAW, everything that I'm going to show you today works exactly the same as long as you have a DAW that is capable of handling Dolby Atmos projects. We are using Cubase today. If you're using Nuendo or Logic or DaVinci Resolve Fairlight, it should work pretty much exactly the same. So this project really has only one loop, and the loop that I used is a loop that comes with either Cubase or Nuendo. I'm not completely sure. So let's have just a brief listen on how that loop sounds so that we know that what we're working with. And it's really a very simple loop. Essentially what I was searching for is something that is reasonably dry so that we can put a reverb on there and also has a little bit of, it's not completely boring to listen to. So what we're going to do is we're going to take this loop and we're going to turn it into a Dolby Atmos object. And then we're going to add a reverb to it. So essentially that's what we are going to do today. Now, the reason why the question about how to put a reverb onto an object track is not completely trivial is because of the way Dolby Atmos works. In Dolby Atmos, objects are rendered at the endpoint device, including all the three-dimensional panning that is going on. And that means that if you would put the reverb directly onto the object track, the endpoint device would actually pan the reverb along with the object. And that is obviously not what you want to have happen. What you want to do instead is separate the reverb from the object, route the object into the Dolby Atmos renderer as an object, and then take the reverb and bake the reverb into the Dolby Atmos bed. And that is relatively straightforward to do as long as you have the right tools to do that. The tool that I'm going to use today is Spatial Ignition. Now, I already talked about Spatial Ignition in a previous video, so I'm not going to do that in this video today. If you want to know more about Spatial Ignition and how this plugin works, a link in the description below. The reason I'm going to use Spatial Ignition is because the workflow that it provides is very convenient for exactly the thing that we need it for. But you could use other 3D reverbs. Any reverb that is capable of calculating the reverb based on the three-dimensional position of a sound source works fine. The workflow would be slightly differently, and if you want me to do a video about that, let me know. I can certainly do that. But here we're going to stick with Spatial Ignition simply because it's the most convenient way to go. So let's get started. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to turn that into a Dolby Atmos project. And for turning that into a Dolby Atmos project, there are two things that we need. We need a bed that is a 7.1.2 track, and we need a bus, which is a 7.1.4 track. I'm always getting the question of why I'm putting the bus as a separate group track and not into the control room. The reason for that is because I constantly switch around. So if you're using the control room, please do that. Here I'm just going to use a separate group track as my Dolby Atmos bus, but once again, you can do that any way you like. So let's just get started. So we are going to add, first of all, the Dolby Atmos bus, which is a 7.1.4 track. So let's add that, and then let's add a bed, and the bed is going to be a 7.1.2. If you want to know more about how exactly Dolby Atmos works, I did a video about how to get started with Dolby Atmos in Cubase. I put a link in the description below. It's relatively straightforward to do. So these are the two tracks that we need. We are going to put the Dolby Atmos renderer onto the bus, and the bed is going to serve essentially as the bed, and the loop that we have here is going to serve as our object. So let's just get the routing set up correctly. For the Dolby Atmos renderer to recognize the loop as something that it can use as an object, it needs to be routed into either the bus or the bed. So I'm going to route it into the bed, and then I'm going to route the Atmos bed into the Atmos bus, and that's essentially it. And if I now play the loop, it should actually still work fine. Yeah, so everything is routed correctly. The next thing is that I need to tell Cubase that I want to start an Atmos project, and for that I need to go into the project settings. So let's go into the project settings, and here under ADM authoring for Dolby Atmos, I'm going to select the renderer. In Cubase I only have the internal option. Once again, in Nuendo you would also have the option to use an external Dolby Atmos renderer, but here we only use the internal one, which is fine. We're going to add a bed. The bed that we're going to add is essentially the Atmos bed. We already prepared it that way, and we're also going to add one object, and the object that we're going to add is the loop that we have. And let's see if we're still getting sound. And I'm still getting sound. I no longer see the meters here. That has to do, and I talked about that in a previous video, that has to do with the fact that the Dolby Atmos panner sends the signal into the Dolby Atmos renderer before it reaches the meters. If you want to see the meters again, you would have to change the global meter settings. We are not going to kind of bother too much about that here. So essentially just to have a look and at how that looks in the Dolby Atmos renderer. So here we have the first 10 channels are essentially the bed. Currently there isn't really anything going on in the bed, and the object is routed to channels 11 and 12. So let's once again play that, and we see that we have action here in 11 and 12. So what I now want to do is I want to add a reverb, and I need to add it in such a way that the actual reverb, so the wet signal is sent into the bed and the dry signal is sent into the object. Now the way I'm going to do that here is through the use, or with the use of Spacelab Ignition. The way this is done is by going into the bed, and in the bed we're going to insert an instance of Spacelab Ignition. And this is, here we are. I have the different reverbs that I can choose from. I'm just going to stick with the default one, which is the large, nice hall. I think that is perfectly fine. There's one thing that we need to set, and that is we need to go into the reverb settings here. And in the reverb settings, we need to set the output format. So here the output format is standard set to stereo, but we have put that onto a bed track, so we need to give it the correct set of channels. The bed track is a 7.1.2, so let's select here a 10 channel layout 7.1.2, and that will essentially turn, or that will calculate the reverb based on a 10 channel layout. The next thing we need to do is we need to go into our Spacelab Ignition plugin and need to tell it what tracks it is supposed to receive. So let's do that. We can define what sources we want to receive here in the sources tab. And there's one source sort of set by default. We just need to define where it's supposed to receive its signal from. And this is done by clicking on the cogwheel here. And then we can set up the source. What we want is we want the input to be our loop. That's essentially what we want. And that will essentially then route the signal from the track through the Beam plugin into Ignition into the bed. So if we now play everything, we should hear the signal with a reverb. However, currently the way it is done is that everything is routed into the Dolby Atmos bed. So if we go into the Dolby Atmos renderer, we now see the signal coming in at the bed and no longer at the object. Now the reason for that is because we have not yet separated the dry signal from the wet signal. Everything is sent into Spacelab Ignition. Now fortunately with Spacelab Ignition there's a very easy way to separate those things. So let's go back into our little project here. And the way we can do that is simply by going into the Beam plugin. And in the Beam plugin you might have noticed there is a little button here that says pass through, and if we enable that button, what it will essentially do is it will not only send the signal into the Ignition plugin, it will simultaneously also continue to send it on the same track. So what is going to happen now is, and let me just open up the Dolby Atmos renderer so that we see that a little better. What is now happening is that the signal is sent on one hand into Spacelab Ignition and is happening, or is kind of creating the bed track, and on the other hand also sent into the Dolby Atmos panner, and the panner then is routed into the object. So the source signal is now rendered twice, once as part of the bed because we send it into the ignition plugin, and there it was used in order to create the reverb and the space and everything. And then we've also forwarded it to the Dolby Atmos panner, and the panner sent it into the object. So we now have it twice. Now, fortunately, that's very easy to remedy. All we really need to do is go into the ignition plugin, and the ignition plugin once again sits on the Dolby Atmos bed. And in the ignition plugin under the current source, what we need to do is essentially just say or tell the ignition plugin that all I really want to hear is the wet signal. So let's put the wet to 100%. And that will now make sure that the signal is that only the reverb is actually sent into the Dolby Atmos bed. So let's just have a listen and maybe just open up the Dolby Atmos renderer. So I'm going to go into the Atmos bus again and clicking on the renderer here. And let's see what's happening now. Right. And now I've separated the reverb from the object, and the wet signal is sent into the bed and the dry signal is sent into the object. So I've now essentially added a reverb to the objects. There's just one caveat in this approach, and that is the fact that I now set the panning independently for the object as well as the reverb, or the way the reverb is calculated. So on one hand, I have the position of the object set in the Dolby Atmos panner, and on the other hand, I have it the part that is sort of responsible for the reverb set in the Spacelab ignition plugin. And I'm going to put them side by side here, and I might actually kind of use the top panner here. So let's click on the top panner. So when I'm moving an object here, this is sort of the way the object will be rendered on the Dolby Atmos renderer, and this is sort of how the reverb will be baked into the Dolby Atmos bed. So if I'm changing the position of the object, so let's just change it here. I don't know. Let's just move it here. Maybe just to the left. So what I would have to do, obviously, because the object is now on the left, I would have to do the same thing with the way the reverb is calculated. So I can simply do that by moving those positions here, and you would have to kind of find out a way that sounds optimal, or that sounds good. These obviously don't completely match, but you can get them to the point where they actually sound reasonably accurate. And what's even more interesting is you could also use it as an effect. So essentially you could use the object and the reverb coming from a completely different space, which might be interesting to kind of experiment with. But if you want to have it as realistic as possible, you would have to make sure that the panning is done correspondingly, so everything is done correctly, even if you automate. So if you automate the position of the objects in the Dolby Atmos renderer, you would have to do the same panning in the ignition plugin. And let's just have a brief listen on how that sounds. And that sounds reasonably accurate. Now, this is really everything I wanted to say today. As you've seen, this is very straightforward to do. Now, if you don't want to use Spacelab Ignition, for example, because you already have a very expensive 3D reverb plugin, you can certainly do that. The way you would approach that is by essentially doing the same thing, separating out the wet signal from the dry signal, sending the wet signal into the bed and the dry signal into the objects. The only thing that you need to make sure is that the panning is done correctly, so that the reverb is calculated with the position that you're also using in the Dolby Atmos panner, to make sure that everything sounds accurately. If you want me to show you how to do that, I can certainly create another video. Just leave a comment in the comment section below. And with that being said, see you at the next video.